5 young boys were falsely accused of a crime they didn't commit. The world watched as they were torn apart by the justice system. But what if I told you, years later, DNA evidence would not only clear their names, but also expose a profound injustice? What was the cost of this wrongful conviction? How did the system fail them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that expose the hidden truths of our society, because we need to keep shining a light on the injustices that still persist. It was the spring of 1989, a city buzzing with energy, excitement, and the promise of a new season. But this was New York City, where danger, tension, and fear often lurked just beneath the surface. It was in this city, this melting pot of dreams and nightmares, that 5 young boys were about to have their lives destroyed. 5 Black and Latinx teens, all under the age of 16, were simply hanging out, enjoying a warm evening in Central Park. They had no idea that within hours, their names would be tied to a crime they had no part in, and the world would view them as monsters. It all started as a normal evening. Kevin, Raymond, Entron, Yusef, and Corey, like so many teenagers, were out exploring the city. They weren't out to cause trouble, weren't out looking for any kind of conflict. They were just kids. Kids who were about to be caught up in something far larger than themselves. Something that would shake the core of the justice system. But in the darkened shadows of Central Park, something was happening that would forever alter the course of their lives. The media, the police, and the prosecutors were all waiting for someone to blame. They needed to solve the case, the brutal assault on a woman that had left the city in shock, and they needed someone to pay. They needed to bring justice, or at least a semblance of it. And, for reasons tied to systemic racism and a deep-seated prejudice, these 5 boys, just boys, became the perfect scapegoats. Kevin Richardson, the youngest of the group, only 14 at the time, was still wide-eyed with the innocence of youth. Yet his life was about to be shattered. Raymond Santana, at just 15, was beginning to come into his own, dreaming of a future, but in a moment, that future would be ripped from him. Entron McCrae, 15 as well, was just a kid trying to have fun like anyone his age. Yusef Salam, 15 and full of potential, never imagined he'd find himself at the center of a crime he had nothing to do with. And Corey Wise, the oldest at 16, was looking out for his friends, never knowing that his decision to stay with them would lead him down a path of horror. They were just kids. And yet, by the time the night was over, they were being painted as criminals, as part of a so-called wolf pack by the media. The term, racially charged and dehumanizing, would stick to them forever. The prosecutors, led by Linda Fairstein, a woman whose biases and hunger for a conviction would soon drive her to betray the very foundation of justice, had already made up their minds. These boys, who had barely begun to understand the weight of the world, were about to face a system rigged against them. With the media fanning the flames of public outrage, and the law enforcement eager to solve the case no matter the cost, the pressure mounted. The city was in a frenzy, calling for justice, calling for someone to pay. And these 5 boys, just boys, became the easiest targets. It didn't matter that they had no evidence against them. It didn't matter that their confessions were coerced and their stories didn't add up. The system had already spoken. They were guilty. The world believed it. And for years, so would they. The pressure started building immediately. The moment the boys were brought in, they knew something was terribly wrong. The air was thick with tension, with eyes that saw them as nothing more than suspects, young, black, and brown teenagers, easy to scapegoat. The room was cold, and the walls felt like they were closing in on them. They could hear the shuffling of papers, the tapping of shoes on the floor, the quiet murmurs of officers moving in and out of the interrogation room. But it wasn't the sounds that made them anxious. It was a feeling of being trapped, isolated, and guilty without reason. The police weren't asking questions anymore. They were telling the boys what had happened, what they had done. "You did it," they said, over and over again. "Just admit it. We know you did it. There was no evidence against them, no reason to believe they were involved in the brutal crime that had taken place that night in Central Park. But the officers didn't care. The accusations were already made, the story was already written, and they just needed these boys to sign their fate. Kevin Richardson, just 14 years old, sat there, his young face a mix of confusion and fear. He didn't understand why they kept accusing him, why they kept telling him he was guilty. He was a child, a boy who had never been in trouble before, a boy who was just out in the park with his friends. But as the hours ticked by, the interrogators got more aggressive, their voices louder, their questions more demanding. "You don't want to be here forever, do you?" One of the officers sneered at him, slamming his fist down on the table. "You want to go home, don't you?" Kevin's heart raced. The words felt like a trap. It wasn't about the truth anymore. It was about breaking him down. They weren't asking for his side of the story. They were telling him what to say. Raymond Santana, only 15, was also under the spotlight. His hands shook as they forced him to repeat what they wanted to hear. "Just say you were there," they told him. "Say you did it, and we'll let you go." But Raymond didn't know what to say. He hadn't done anything. The silence was deafening, and each second felt like an eternity. The officer's eyes were filled with disdain. "If you don't confess, this is going to get much worse for you," they threatened. Antron McCrae sat slumped in the corner of the room, trying to remain calm. He felt like his whole world was spinning. He was a 15-year-old kid who had no idea how to navigate this adult nightmare. He was terrified. But the fear wasn't just about what was happening in that room. It was about the realization that no one was listening. No one was there to protect him. He wasn't seen as a person, just as a suspect. Yusef Salam, only 15 as well, knew something was wrong. But the pressure was unbearable. The officers' faces twisted with anger, their voices cutting through the room like daggers. "Admit it, and we'll go easy on you," they barked. "Deny it, and this will get much worse." Yusef clenched his fists, his chest tight, but the words they were saying hit him like a blow to the gut. He wanted to cry out, to tell them he was innocent, but the words just wouldn't come. Every time he tried to explain, they interrupted him. Every time he tried to speak, they shut him down. Corey Wise, the oldest at 16, had seen a lot in his short life, but nothing had prepared him for this. His friends were being pressured, and he felt powerless to protect them. They were all being told to confess to something they didn't do. Their lives were being taken from them, piece by piece, and all they could do was sit there, desperate for someone to hear the truth. But no one was listening. Not the officers. Not the system. Not the world outside. The officers circled them like vultures, relentless in their pursuit of a confession. They weren't interested in the truth. They wanted something to hang their case on, something to justify the narrative they had already created. "Just admit it," they insisted, their voices growing colder, harsher. "You will be out of here in no time." They promised that a confession would end this nightmare, but they never told them the cost. And so, the boys, exhausted, scared, and broken, began to bend. They began to give in, each one telling the officers what they wanted to hear. It wasn't the truth. It was just survival. But the officers weren't looking for the truth. They had already made up their minds. The confessions weren't real, but they didn't need to be. The case was closed in their eyes. These boys had already been convicted by the world. The system didn't care about their innocence. It just needed someone to blame. And that someone, those 5 innocent boys, was now trapped in a nightmare from which they couldn't wake up. Despite their denials, the boys were forced to confess to something they didn't do. It didn't matter that their stories didn't match the evidence or that the details of their confessions didn't align with the facts. They were trapped in a system that was determined to break them, and the pressure was suffocating. It didn't matter that the truth was slipping through their fingers, because the narrative had already been set. Their confessions weren't the result of guilt. They were the result of fear, exhaustion, and coercion. The boys were forced to sign statements they didn't believe in, told that they had no choice but to comply if they ever hoped to get out of this nightmare. But no one cared about the truth. The officers didn't care that they were innocent. All that mattered was that the case could be closed, and the public's hunger for justice could be satisfied. The boys' voices were drowned out by the constant barrage of accusations and threats. As the confessions were being gathered, the media began to do its damage. The press, always hungry for a sensational story, painted the boys as monsters, savage, violent teens out for blood. The narrative was set. They were a wolf pack, a dangerous group of young black and brown men roaming the streets of Central Park, terrorizing anyone in their path. It was a term that reinforced every ugly stereotype about Black and Latinx youth in New York City. A term that stripped them of their humanity, reduced them to nothing more than a frightening, faceless group. The media didn't care about the truth. It didn't matter that the boys were just kids who were still learning about the world around them. They were already judged guilty in the eyes of the public. The press didn't give them a voice. They didn't give them a chance to tell their side of the story. They were guilty by default, and that guilt was sealed with every headline that labeled them as dangerous criminals. The press painted a vivid picture, one that matched their biased assumptions. They called them thugs, criminals, animals. Each word stung, each phrase cut deeper. Their names were splashed across front pages, forever linked to the brutal attack in Central Park. The public believed the narrative. The outrage was deafening. People who had never even met the boys were already condemning them. The city of New York, once their home, now turned against them, fueled by the racist rhetoric spewing from every corner of the media. Their fate was sealed, not by evidence, but by a story that had already been told. They were monsters in the eyes of the public. There was no room for doubt. There was no room for innocence. The entire city of New York, it seemed, was against them. Protesters, parents, and ordinary citizens all took to the streets, fueled by a sense of outrage and an unshakable belief that these boys were guilty. They didn't care about the facts. They didn't care about the truth. The system had already decided. But what was the real cause of this miscarriage of justice? What happens when the truth is drowned out by the noise of public opinion? The boys had no way of knowing that, as their world crumbled. They were caught in a system that didn't care about them. A system that was more concerned with preserving its own image than it was with actually finding the truth. Their world was falling apart, and no one seemed to notice that they were innocent. They were already being punished, and the trial hadn't even begun. Years later, after all the pain, after all the years spent behind bars, the truth finally began to surface. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a loud, undeniable force. DNA evidence, clear, irrefutable, was brought to light, and with it came the devastating truth. The boys had been innocent all along. Their names, dragged through the mud by the media, by a broken system, were now being cleared. What was once buried in the lies and confessions, forced by hours of interrogation and manipulation, was finally brought to the surface. It was there, in cold, scientific fact. The boys were not the perpetrators. They had been wrongfully convicted. Imagine the weight of it, the years they had spent in prison, the fear, the isolation, the stigma. All that time lost, all the suffering they had endured. Now, in one fell swoop, it was being undone. And yet, the damage had been done. The scars would never completely fade. But at least, finally, there was something tangible, something undeniable, that could set them free. The truth. But here's where it gets even more intense. The prosecution, the media, those who had been so quick to condemn them, tried everything in their power to bury the truth. They knew the implications. The case against these boys was built on nothing but lies and biases, but now that the DNA evidence had been presented, they were scrambling to erase the truth. It wasn't just about clearing their names anymore. This was about exposing an entire system that had failed them, a system that had allowed them to rot in prison for years without a single thought for their innocence. The media, who had painted them as animals, a wolf pack out for blood, were now facing the uncomfortable reality that their sensationalism had led to this moment of reckoning. These boys weren't guilty. They weren't animals. They were victims. But the media wasn't ready to admit it. They had built their narrative. They had shaped the world's view of these boys as dangerous, violent criminals. And the truth, no matter how undeniable, was now a threat to that carefully crafted story. For years, the media had ignored the boys' innocence. They had written them off as guilty long before the trial, long before any evidence was even considered. They hadn't cared about the truth. They had cared about the story. They didn't care that these boys were forced into confessions, coerced into accepting blame they hadn't earned. They cared only about what would sell, what would get the most attention, the most outrage. The boys' lives were collateral damage in a larger war for ratings and sensationalism. But now, DNA evidence, hard, scientific fact, was shaking that narrative to its core. And the prosecution? They were just as guilty. Linda Fairstein, the lead prosecutor who had made sure to paint these boys as the worst kind of criminals, now found herself cornered. The evidence that had once seemed to support her case now exposed her for what she truly was. Someone who had ignored the facts. Someone who had used the system to imprison innocent kids. The DNA proved it all. The boys had been telling the truth all along. They had been the victims of a prejudiced system, a system that had already written them off because of their race, their age, and the fear of the unknown. But the story wasn't just about the boys finally being cleared. The revelation of the DNA evidence didn't just clear their names. It exposed the cracks in the very foundation of the justice system. It was a reminder that this wasn't just about 5 innocent teens being freed. It was about a system that had routinely failed people of color, particularly Black and Latinx people, for generations. The deep flaws in the prosecution, the media, and law enforcement were now laid bare for the world to see. The injustices these boys had faced were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, systemic issue that had been going on for far too long. The DNA didn't just clear their names. It opened the door to the uncomfortable truth about how deeply racism was embedded in the justice system. These 5 boys had been used as pawns in a game of public outrage, media manipulation, and political expediency. And as the evidence surfaced, so did the uncomfortable reality that the system had failed them, and that it had failed countless others before them. The moment of truth was a long time coming. It wasn't just a turning point for these 5 boys. It was a turning point for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. It was a stark reminder that the pursuit of justice was never meant to be about who you are, or where you come from, or what the public wants to believe. It was meant to be about the truth. But in this case, the truth had to fight tooth and nail to get out from under the weight of lies. It had to claw its way to the surface, despite a system that was designed to ignore it. And when it finally did, it was undeniable. The boys were innocent, and now the world knew it. The boys, now men, had finally received some compensation for the suffering they endured, $41 million from the city. It seemed like a staggering amount of money, and to many, it might have seemed like a fitting price for the years they had lost. But the truth was far more complex. No amount of money, no matter how much, could undo the years they spent in prison. No amount of money could erase the trauma they had lived through, the trauma of being treated like criminals because of their race, of having their futures stolen from them by a system that was supposed to protect them, not destroy them. They had missed out on their childhoods, their educations, their families. They had been denied a life, a chance at something better, all because the justice system had already decided their fate before they even had a chance to speak. It didn't matter that they were innocent. The system had already painted them as guilty. And while $41 million might buy them material things, it could never buy back the years of pain and loss, the years of injustice they had to endure. It could never bring back the time they had lost behind bars, the friendships and family connections that had been fractured, or the emotional scars that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. But their story didn't just end with the exoneration. It was far from over. Their fight was not just about reclaiming their names. It was about something much larger. Their exoneration was a victory, yes, but it also served as a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained racism is in our justice system. Their case wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just a fluke of fate. It was a reflection of a larger, more systemic problem that has been perpetuated for decades, if not centuries. These boys had been dehumanized. They had been seen not as innocent children, but as threats, as other. They had been scapegoated, blamed for something they didn't do, simply because of the color of their skin and the neighborhood they came from. And this wasn't just their story. This wasn't just a mistake made by a few individuals in power. This is what happens when a system, from the police to the courts to the media, chooses to see people of color as guilty before they even have a chance to prove their innocence. This is what happens when racism runs so deep that it becomes woven into the very fabric of our legal system, where Black and Latinx teens are treated as criminals from the moment they are born. Their story was a powerful lesson in the dangers of a biased, broken system. A system that does not see people of color as human beings, but as potential criminals to be locked away. This was not a rare case. It was one of many. Every day in America, there are countless others who are wrongly accused, falsely convicted, and imprisoned. Every day, there are more stories like theirs. Stories of young Black and Latinx children who are being pushed into a system that will never give them a fair chance, simply because of the color of their skin. And that's the real tragedy. The truth of their case isn't just about what happened to them. It's about what continues to happen to so many others who don't have the chance to fight back, who don't have the chance to have their voices heard, or the evidence to clear their names. The exoneration of these 5 men was a victory, yes. But it was also a powerful reminder that the fight for justice doesn't end with one case. It doesn't end with one victory. The fight for justice is ongoing, and it's about ensuring that no more innocent lives are lost to a system that is more focused on punishment than on truth. Their case didn't just expose a failure in the justice system, it exposed the entire system. And though they received compensation, the real reward came not in the form of money, but in the way they turned their pain into a beacon of hope. Their fight, their victory, serves as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a reminder that, no matter how deep the injustice runs, there is always a chance for the truth to be revealed. But we must continue to push, to fight, and to never let the truth be buried again. What do you think about the injustice these 5 young men faced? How should we, as a society, fight back against a system that is clearly broken? Their story is a painful reminder of just how deeply racism is embedded in our justice system, and how much work is still left to be done. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How can we make sure this doesn't happen again? How can we ensure that every person, regardless of their race, is given the fair treatment they deserve? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that expose the hidden truths of our society, because we need to keep shining a light on the injustices that still persist. The Central Park 5 story isn't just a moment in history, it's a warning sign. A sign that we must keep pushing for justice, for fairness, and for equality. These 5 men didn't just fight for their freedom. They fought for a system that was failing them, and countless others, every single day. The fight is far from over, but the truth is out. And no matter what, the truth will always shine through.